You know, Hebrews 12 is a very interesting, very important. It relies very much on its context and on chapter 11 in particular. He tells us we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, but that's immediately after chapter 11 where he's gone through an enormous list of faithful people in history and how God has worked through them and how God has cherished their faith. He calls Jesus the author and perfecter of our faith. In other words, Jesus is the beginning point of what our faith hinges on, and He is the perfecter. He's the end point. And then He sets up this understanding of Christ's suffering and Christ's hardships that He faced. And that's sort of where we're coming from today, beginning in Hebrews 12, verse 4, talking about hardships. You know, Bill Cosby relates a funny story from his childhood about a hardship, I suppose, that a child would perceive as a hardship, something that might actually be for the better. He says one time he and his brother were in their living room playing basketball. They weren't supposed to play basketball in the house, but they were playing in the living room. His father was sitting in his chair, holding a book, reading it. Apparently not stopping them from playing basketball in the house. Well, I guess one of them passed the ball or threw the ball to the other, and it missed, and it hit a glass coffee table and broke it. And throughout the whole time, the glass shattered. His father never looked up from the book, just sat there and just stared straight at the book. Never took his eyes off of it. And his mother came running in from the other room, and she had a big stick. And she said, "I am going to bust you in two." And he said from that, without ever looking up, without saying a single other word, his father continued to read the book and said, "Why in the world would you want twice as many?" Now, for a child, that's a frightening thing to have your mother come in with a stick and say, "I'm going to bust you in two." You might call that a hardship. But when you look at it in the grand scheme of things, there's really a greater purpose behind it. It probably would have done him and his brother a little bit of good to learn the punishment about playing basketball in the house. But sometimes maybe that hardship could have a greater meaning behind it. And I'm willing to bet that might be true of some of the difficulties that we face in life as well. Maybe the hardships that we encounter have a little bit more to them than just a miserable time in our life. Maybe instead of sitting around and just thinking, "God, how could you allow this to happen?" maybe we can actually learn from them. This year so far, we've been talking about growing closer to God and just taking that next step closer to God. Well, perhaps we could even grow through our hardships. Maybe they can even benefit us somehow. So today in Hebrews 12, I want to look at 3 truths about hardships that we encounter in our lives. And I want to see what they mean for us. So if you look at Hebrews 12, starting in verse 4, it starts off, "In your struggle against sin, you've not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. And you have forgotten that word of encouragement that addresses you as sons. My son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when He rebukes you. Because the Lord disciplines those He loves, and He punishes everyone He accepts as a son." The first truth about hardships in life is that hardships actually can serve as discipline. Hardships, when things don't go right, they can serve as discipline. Now here he says, in your struggle against sin, you've not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. Now, this verse, I think, is very heavily dependent upon verse 3, the verse right before it, which says, "Of Jesus, consider Him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart." Now, he says, what he does is he sets up Christ as this example for us to follow in terms of hardships. And in speaking of the hardships, he says, in your struggle against sin. Now, I don't think that he's actually referring so much here to the temptations that we face. Rather, if this verse is parallel to verse 3, where he says, "Consider Him who endured such opposition from sinful men," I think that perhaps the sin he's talking about us struggling with is very much so the physical difficulties that we have from living in a sinful world. He tells them, "You have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood as Jesus has shed His blood," as many of the people of faith in Hebrews chapter 11 had shed their blood for God. But apparently, when he says that the Christians receiving this letter are under some sort of persecution, some sort of problem is going on, but apparently it's not bad enough yet that they're actually being executed for their faith. Well, after talking about all these hardships that they're going through, he then goes into Proverbs chapter 3, which speaks of God's discipline to His children. And so basically he equates the hardships that we're going through with discipline from God. And it may be that the difficulties that we face in life could be God's discipline. In Deuteronomy 8, verse 2, it tells us, "Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the desert these 40 years, to humble you and to test you, in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep His commands. He humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your fathers had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord." In verse 5, he says, "Know then in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, so the Lord your God disciplines you." As the Israelites wandered in the desert for 40 years, they had numerous hardships. They had trouble not having enough food. Then they needed water. Then they wanted meat. They wanted all these different things. And God endured it. He took care of them. But throughout all their hardships, it was all intended to build them in some way, to make them better, to discipline them. So the hardships that we encounter may be actually disciplined by God. But then we have to ask the question, if the difficult times in my life, the hard times, the bad things that happen to me, if they're disciplined, wouldn't that imply that God has caused all these bad things that have happened in my life? Well, we need to understand, first and foremost, above absolutely everything, is that God and evil are two entirely separate things. They're complete opposites. God has no hand in evil. I used to have a friend when we were training for ministry together, and it's funny that he was training for ministry and he would do this all the time, but every single time something bad happened to him, he would always just sort of assume that God was doing it. And I don't know why. I don't think it was intentional. I don't think he was trying to blame God for anything bad, but I think that was just his first reaction to anything bad. He'd say, "Oh, well, I guess God killed my pet. Oh, I guess God made my car wreck. I guess God caused all my problems." And I just say to him, "Josh, you can't blame God for every single problem. Sometimes bad things happen just because they happen." Now, it may be that sometimes something unpleasant may happen to us because God has done it to discipline us in some way, but that's not evil in the same way that a father could discipline his son for playing in the street, and that would not be evil. Job 5:17 says, "Blessed is the man whom God corrects, so do not despise the discipline of the Almighty." Well, God may cause some unpleasant things to happen for our benefit, but then again, what about the actual bad things that happen to us, the really evil things that happen in this world? In our text, the recipients of this letter are apparently facing some sort of anti-Christ hatred towards Christianity. Are we supposed to assume that God has caused that? Well, no, but that does not mean that God cannot work through a bad situation to discipline them still. So when do we know whether or not the hardships we're going through is actually the discipline that God is using? Well, in James 1, verse 2, he writes, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, when you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance." I think if it is an opportunity to grow in perseverance, to mature spiritually somehow, I think we can rightfully call an event in our life discipline. I remember when I was young, I didn't really understand exactly what discipline was. My dad and I were watching a television show. And it was about new recruits coming into the Army. I don't know, it might have been Gomer Pyle or something. I don't remember what the show was. But new recruits were coming into the Army, and they were going through boot camp. And from the time they got off the bus, people would yell at them, and they would be running drills and doing a lot of difficult things. And I remember asking my dad, why do they yell at them? Why do they treat them like that? And he told me, well, it's for discipline. And being young, being always on the receiving side of discipline at that point, I said, well, why are they being disciplined? They haven't done anything wrong yet. I didn't understand. Discipline is anything that actually can build you up and benefit you. It could be a punishment for something. But then again, discipline includes weightlifting. Discipline includes sectioning off a part of your day to spend time in prayer and studying the Bible. Discipline is anything that's going to build you up. So, with that in mind, the question is, how should we react when we face hardships that might be God's discipline in our life? Well, this quote from Proverbs, in Proverbs chapter 3, I think gives us a very, very good balance on the situation. Here it gives us two extremes that we're supposed to avoid. It says, first off, do not make light of the Lord's discipline. So don't just ignore it and brush it off and refuse to learn from it. But then again, it also says, don't lose heart. So don't be so oppressed and so controlled by your situation that you can't function or that you worry about it. Now, when we face a hardship that we believe is discipline, we should handle it, endure it. In the process, we should try to build up something from it, gain, learn from it, build perseverance, build patience. But sometimes the hardships that we face can serve as discipline. So if you look now at Hebrews 12, verse 7, let's look at another truth in our text. It says, endure hardships as discipline. God is treating you as sons. For what son is not disciplined by his father? If you're not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are illegitimate children and not true sons. Second truth here is that discipline shows us something very important. Discipline shows us that we are God's children. God disciplines us as a father would his child. Now, I think our author understands one basic simple thing here, and that is that discipline is necessary for a parent-child relationship. It's a natural part of the relationship. And from that, he reasons that God's discipline should assure us that we are actually God's children. He asks this rhetorical question, what son is not disciplined by his father? You know, working with the definition of discipline that we are, even Jesus underwent discipline. In Hebrews 5, verse 8, it says, although he was a son, he learned obedience from what he suffered. See, all parents will discipline their children. I think that's actually the mark of a good parent, is disciplining your child. Proverbs 23:13 says, do not withhold discipline from a child. If you punish him with the rod, he will not die. Because we know discipline is necessary for that parent-child relationship. And we know what happens when people don't receive enough discipline. How many times have you been out to I can guarantee you, everyone in this room has said or thought this at some point in your life. I promise you this. You've been out to a public place. Someone's had their kids. They're not really watching the kids, and the kids are running around and bouncing off the walls and doing something, and you always think this. If they were my kids, and you can fill in the blank after that. You ever think that? Well, because you just understand discipline is part of the parent-child relationship. When I see that, I don't get frustrated at the children. I get frustrated with the parents for not taking care of their kids, not fulfilling their duties. But here's the thing. If God is our Father, that's going to imply a few things. First off, that's going to imply He will discipline us because that discipline is a part of our relationship. Second, as a good Father, He will not discipline us beyond an appropriate measure. 2 Corinthians 4 verse 8 says, we're hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. In other words, life will be difficult at times, but God will never allow it to be too difficult. His discipline certainly included in that. So discipline shows us something very, very important. God has not given up on us yet. And if we realize when we face a hardship that it is God disciplining us, then we realize that God is our Father and He's instructing us for a reason. He has an intention in mind. Really, considering that, our hardship should be an encouragement to us, because every time something goes wrong, we should remember, well, God has not given up on me. Revelation 3:19 says, those whom I love, I rebuke and discipline. You know, in the story of Robin Hood, it's one of the classic stories told about Robin Hood is that he entered a archery contest one time and he disguised himself so that he wouldn't be found out. Well, while he was in the contest, he was doing exceptionally well, and I guess he drew a little bit more attention to himself than what he should have. But everyone was noticing him. People were starting to get suspicious because he was shooting very well. He was an expert marksman. You know what expert marksmen do? They hit the target. A marksman is known for his marksmanship. A craftsman is known for his craftsmanship. Well, a parent is known by their role of a parent and the discipline that they give to their children. So when God disciplines us, it's as a loving father disciplining his children. And verse 7 tells us here to endure hardships as discipline. Now there's a reason it actually tells us to do that. That's because this is actually not required. This is advice. We don't have to look at the hardships in life and see them as discipline. That's why when some people don't do that, that's why when they face some sort of hardship, they just say, God, how in the world could you let this happen to me? Rather, we should see our hardships as discipline. So when something does go wrong in your life, when you do have a difficult time, I want you to think of it as discipline. When you think about hard times that you faced in your past, think of it as discipline. Recognize God is or was trying to build you and was trying to help you somehow through that discipline. And if He's done it before, He'll do it again, and He'll continue to take care of you. So, the hardships that we face really can serve as discipline. We know that discipline is part of that parent-child relationship, and it shows that God is our Father. Let's look at one more truth from our text now in Hebrews 12, starting in verse 9. He says, "Moreover, we have all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of our spirits and live? Our fathers disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good, that we may share in His holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it." Last truth, something we've been touching on, we've been lightly dealing with, and now we don't really have anywhere to go except to address it directly, and that is that God's discipline is good for us. He carries out this analogy a little bit further about a father's discipline. He says our human fathers disciplined us, and if we heeded our human father's discipline at all, we would probably look back and be thankful, realize that we would probably be a lot more messed up if our parents had not disciplined us the way they should have. So why shouldn't we take the same approach with God's discipline? Shouldn't we look back at it and be thankful? He says our fathers disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good. Now, just the truth of the matter is human fathers are imperfect. We're all fallible. And while human fathers may try to do good and train us right, occasionally their discipline may be imperfect. Maybe a father will occasionally discipline their child too harshly. Maybe they'll fail to discipline their child for something that they should. Maybe they'll discipline their child out of anger instead of out of love. And all those things like that, they happen because our human fathers are imperfect. And it may still do us good, but it's not just perfect discipline. Whereas God, on the other hand, He is our heavenly Father, and He is perfectly wise. He's timeless, and so He knows the result of everything that happens, and so His discipline is going to be perfect. He disciplines us for our good, that we may share in His holiness. As long as we respond right to God's discipline, it will benefit us, and it will help us to grow. And obviously, discipline is not always enjoyable, but that doesn't mean it's not good. Lots of things that are good for you are not very pleasant at the time. Kids don't like to go to the doctor to get a shot, but when they get older, they understand, hey, that shot kept me from getting sick for a very long time. Sure, they go through a few seconds of pain, but the good result lasts for years. The suffering is short, but the benefits are long-lasting. And the hardships that we deal with in life, they're not pleasant, but sometimes they may still be good for us. Romans 5 verse 3 says, "We rejoice in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. And hope does not disappoint us, because God has poured out His love into our hearts by the Holy Spirit, whom He has given us." The suffering is temporary, but the results are long-lasting. That is especially true of spiritual realities. When we suffer, it's for a little while. Maybe for a few days. Maybe for a few years. Maybe for a whole life. But the benefits that we will receive in our spiritual maturity is something that's going to benefit us forever. 2 Corinthians 4:17 says, "Our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all." Our hardships throughout life are like a needle in the arm that hurts for a few seconds, but it gives us a vaccination that lasts for years. So, with that said, looking at discipline, knowing discipline is not always pleasant, we may ask the question, why does God actually discipline us to get a point across then? Why doesn't He just tell us? Why doesn't He just instruct us? Well, sometimes discipline is necessary because it ingrains something into us. If God just said, be more patient, have more hope, put more faith in me, I doubt we'd follow that very well. In fact, God does tell us that all throughout the Bible, and we're not perfect in keeping that. But sometimes discipline helps to ingrain it. When I was training in Knoxville, my teacher taught me a very simple submission called an arm bar. It's used for breaking an opponent's arm and ending a fight. And he taught me this submission, showed me how to do it a few times. It is pretty simple, not too hard to do. And I was sparring with my teacher one time in class, and he was going easy on me, and he let me get into a position where I could arm bar him. And I started to go into the arm bar, and I made a little mistake, one thing he had told me a couple times not to mess up on. I made that mistake, and immediately he jumped up, and he started yelling. Now, he had a little bit of a temper problem. He started yelling, no, 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 really loud, and it was embarrassing. Probably all 20 people in our class just turned around and stared at me. And I was feeling pretty embarrassed at the point. Now granted, his discipline was not really, appropriate because it's kind of done out of anger. I could tell he felt a little bad about it later, but the discipline still did me good. It embarrassed me. It was not something I enjoyed. It was unpleasant. The result was, for several years after that, and probably for the rest of my life, I don't think I've ever made that same mistake again, because it embarrassed me so bad. Every time I start to do an arm bar, I think, no, I'm going to get in trouble if I do this. See, that discipline was ingrained into me. Sometimes it's necessary that discipline be the instruction. When soldiers go into the army and they go through their boot camp and they go through all their training, they're disciplined. They want things to become instinctual, so they're disciplined into them. If as they were going off to combat, their drill sergeant just said, oh, by the way, it might be a good idea if you hear gunfire to get down on the ground and crawl towards it, that wouldn't work in a battle. That wouldn't come to mind when they were actually in a combat situation. They'd panic and they'd follow their instinct. No, it needs to be disciplined into them. That's why they make them get on the ground and crawl through mud and water under barbed wire with live fire being shot over their heads, because it ingrains it. They have to know it. Discipline is immensely important for teaching us what we need to know. And so it's too important to just disregard. Proverbs 13:18 says, he who ignores discipline comes to poverty and shame, but whoever heeds correction is honored. So I want to challenge you today to sometime make a list. It doesn't have to be an actual written list, but maybe a mental list, but make a list of some of the difficult times that you've had in life, some of the hardships that you've faced in your past. And I want you to examine each of those and ask the question, could it be that God was using this as discipline? Was God teaching me something through this? Did God teach me or try to teach me to be more patient? Did He teach me to endure? Did He teach me to trust Him more? Was God teaching you through those situations? And I think you'll find many times God was trying to teach you something, and He was using those situations for your good and for your benefit. And so the next time that you go through a hardship in life, that something seems difficult, think back and remember those situations. And remember, God did good for you in the midst of your hardships, and that He can certainly do it again. So, obviously, hardships will come at some point in life. But I think sometimes there's a little bit more to them than what we might realize. When something seems difficult, maybe it's discipline. Maybe it means that God is your Father. Maybe it's God trying to make you better. If there's anything I learned here from this passage in Hebrews 12, it's that hardships benefit us if we will allow them to. Hardships will benefit us if we will allow them to.